the storm, and the silence. The rain fell softly against the tall glass walls of the Hale Corporation, streaking silver lines down the skyline as if the heavens were washing the city clean. Inside, the vast open-plan office glowed dimly beneath the last of the fluorescent lights, where only one desk still had a lamp burning. Sophia sat there, her tired eyes fixed on the blueprint spread before her. She had been there since morning, lost in the rhythm of her work, the hum of computers and the ticking of the wall clock that no one else seemed to notice. The rest of the staff had already gone home hours ago, their laughter fading into the storm outside. She didn't even realize the silence that had taken over the building until she looked up and saw her own reflection in the glass. The office behind her was dark, still, and empty. Sophia exhaled softly and rubbed her eyes. She had joined the company only 6 months ago as a junior designer, just one of many faces in a crowd of ambitious people chasing promotions and approval. But unlike them, she was never loud, never bold. She had grown up believing that quiet people stayed safe, that speaking too much or feeling too deeply only led to pain. Her parents' broken marriage, her failed scholarship, and the years of trying to prove herself had carved invisible walls around her. She worked hard, stayed polite, and kept her head down. That was how she survived. But sometimes, late at night when she was alone with her thoughts, she wondered if survival was really the same as living. The elevator lights blinked, but when she pressed the button, nothing happened. She tried again, then glanced at her phone to call security. Dead battery. Her heart sank slightly. She turned toward the stairwell, but the heavy metal door refused to move. The building had automatic locks that activated at 9. She had stayed too late again. For a moment she stood there, unsure whether to panic or laugh at her own carelessness. Then she heard footsteps, steady, unhurried, and echoing through the empty hallway. Her body froze before she even turned. In a world where she trusted no one, even a sound could feel like a storm. When she looked up, Andrew Hale was standing at the other end of the corridor. The CEO of Hale Corporation, the man whose name appeared on every design, every project, every paycheck. He wasn't in his usual suit jacket now, only dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled above his elbows, and a loosened tie that somehow made him look both tired and powerful. His presence filled the space like gravity, quiet but impossible to ignore. "Didn't expect anyone else to still be here," he said in his calm, deep voice that carried easily through the silence. His words weren't cold, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that made people straighten their posture without realizing. Sophia quickly gathered her papers, embarrassed. "I was finishing a layout for the Rome project," she said softly. "I didn't realize the time." Andrew's eyes flickered toward the large digital clock above reception. "Building locks everything at 9, he said. "Automatic security system. It won't open again until 6. She blinked, confused. "So we're locked in?" He nodded once, looking more thoughtful than concerned. "Seems like it." She tried to hide her nervous smile, unsure how to react. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rolling distantly across the horizon. The sound filled the silence between them. Andrew turned slightly, as if debating whether to leave her there, then sighed and motioned toward the corner of the hallway. "There's one office that doesn't lock automatically. The system skips the executive floor in case of emergencies. You'll be more comfortable there than out here." He started walking, his footsteps echoing steadily against the marble. Sophia hesitated for only a moment before following. Her heels clicked softly behind his as they passed through the glass corridor where the city lights shimmered below them like a sea of fireflies. When they reached his private office, Andrew held the door open. It wasn't just an office, it was a world apart. The walls were lined with art, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Sophia stood near the doorway, unsure if she should sit or stand. Andrew set his phone down on the table and loosened his tie further. "You've been working hard lately," he said, glancing at her. "I've noticed." She didn't know what to say to that. People like him didn't notice people like her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slightly, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee from the sleek machine by the wall and handed one to her. "You look like you need it," he said. She accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing the warm porcelain. For the first time in months, someone had done something kind for her without expecting anything in return. The gesture was small, but it felt enormous. The minutes passed quietly, the rain still whispering outside. The golden light in the office made the moment feel unreal, suspended between dream and memory. "Why do you work so hard?" Andrew finally asked. His voice was calm, but his eyes were studying her as if he was searching for something beneath her practiced composure. Sophia hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Because if I stop, I might disappear." Her honesty surprised even herself. Andrew's brow furrowed slightly. "Disappear?" She looked down into her coffee. "People forget quiet ones. You have to work twice as hard to be seen and even harder to be remembered." Andrew was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe the problem isn't that you're quiet. Maybe the problem is that too many people are afraid of silence." His words struck her like lightning, soft yet powerful. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't the untouchable CEO the magazines wrote about. There was weariness behind his calm, loneliness behind his strength. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked. He chuckled quietly. "Every day. But power doesn't allow weakness, does it?" Sophia smiled faintly, sensing the truth in his tone. "Maybe it does if the power comes from understanding instead of control." He met her eyes then, and for a fleeting second, the air between them changed. Not romantically, but deeply. Like two people who had finally found someone who understood the same kind of emptiness. The night stretched on, and their conversation drifted between memories, ambitions, and regrets. She learned that he had built the company from nothing, that he had once been just another architect with a broken dream. He learned that she painted at night, that she dreamed of designing places that made people feel safe. As the city lights dimmed and the storm softened, something inside Sophia began to shift. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as an employee, not as a project name, but as a person with a heartbeat and a story. The walls around her heart began to crack, not from romance, but from truth. When dawn finally touched the edge of the windows, turning the rain into gold, Sophia realized how strange it felt to not want the night to end. Andrew stood beside her, both of them watching the city come alive again. "You'll do great things, Sophia," he said quietly. "Don't let the world convince you you're invisible." She smiled, holding his gaze for a long second that said everything words couldn't. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that single morning, before the locks released and the city stirred awake, something inside her did too. It wasn't love. It was awakening. The kind that changes everything you thought you knew about yourself. The office that never slept. The morning after the storm brought a strange calm to the city. The streets were slick with silver light, and the air carried the scent of wet concrete and possibility. Sophia walked through the glass doors of Hale Corporation with a quiet smile that she didn't even know she was wearing. Her reflection in the polished marble floor looked somehow different. Softer, brighter. The sleepless night in Andrew's office had not only left her with tired eyes, but with a heart that felt strangely awake. For the first time, she wasn't walking into work just to survive another day. She was walking into something new, a beginning she couldn't yet name. Inside, the hum of keyboards and the soft chatter of morning filled the space. People hurried by with coffee cups, documents, and deadlines. None of them knew that the quiet girl at the far corner of the design floor had spent the night in conversation with the man who ran it all. It wasn't a secret in the ordinary sense. It was something sacred, too human to explain. Andrew walked past her once that morning, speaking to a project manager, and their eyes met briefly. He didn't pause, didn't smile, didn't say a word, but that single look carried 1,000 unspoken sentences. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. Two people who had seen the truth inside each other and decided to keep it safe. Sophia buried herself in work. The Rome project demanded precision, layouts, sketches, digital blueprints that captured both luxury and soul. Every click of her mouse felt steadier now. Every design line seemed more alive. She realized that something had changed in her approach. Where she once hesitated, now she trusted her instincts. The night's conversation with Andrew had done something that years of schooling hadn't. It had taught her to believe in her own worth. Her fear of being invisible began to fade, replaced by quiet confidence. It was strange how a few words, shared in honesty, could shift the weight of an entire life. Days passed, and Andrew became a silent observer. He never interfered with her work, never complimented her openly, but his eyes would sometimes linger when she presented a design. He noticed how her voice had gained strength, how her suggestions carried weight in meetings. Others began to notice too. The same colleagues who once ignored her now listened when she spoke. Her ideas started shaping projects, her sketches got pinned to the main board, and her name appeared on client presentations. The office that had once been cold and mechanical suddenly seemed to respond to her presence. She wasn't just existing in the background anymore, she was influencing the rhythm of the entire floor. But the more she grew, the more she noticed Andrew withdrawing behind his walls again. It wasn't rejection, it was distance. The same man who had shared his loneliness with her that night was now quieter than ever. He watched from afar, spoke in short sentences during meetings, and always carried that same unreadable calm. Sophia didn't understand it at first. She wondered if she had said something wrong or if he regretted opening up to her. But one evening, as she passed by his office door and saw the light still on, she realized that maybe his silence wasn't about her. Maybe it was his own way of fighting the things he couldn't name. Inside his office, Andrew sat with a file open but unread. The city stretched endlessly before him, glowing with promises that felt hollow. For years, he had built walls made of discipline, power, and responsibility. He had convinced himself that he needed no one. That connection only led to disappointment. But that night with Sophia had stirred something in him he couldn't control. Her quiet courage, her raw honesty, her simple question, "Do you ever get tired?" had cut through his armor. Now he couldn't walk through his own company without thinking of her voice echoing in the silence. She was a reminder of what he had lost while chasing everything he thought mattered. That Friday evening, as the office began to empty, Sophia stayed behind again. The Rome project was nearing a major submission, and she wanted to perfect every detail. Outside, the city lights blinked like 1,000 watching eyes. Inside, her monitor glowed with blue light that reflected softly in her tired eyes. When the elevator doors opened behind her, she didn't turn at first. But then she heard that familiar calm voice, low and deliberate. "You're still here." She turned to see Andrew standing there, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up, holding 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with milk. "You always work late," he said as he approached. "Habit or something else?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe both." He placed 1 cup beside her, then leaned against the desk beside her workstation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the machines filled the quiet. Finally, he said, "Do you ever feel like this place never sleeps?" She looked up at him, puzzled. "The office?" He nodded slowly. "The building. The people. The ambition. Everyone's running, chasing, proving something. Even at night, you can feel it humming. Like it doesn't know how to rest." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it's because no one wants to be forgotten. If the lights go off, maybe people fear they'll disappear with them." Andrew turned his gaze toward the city. "And yet the brightest buildings are often the emptiest." His words sank deep into her heart. There was something almost poetic about the way he said it. Not as a complaint, but as confession. She studied his face under the soft golden light. There was strength there, yes, but also loneliness. The kind of loneliness that success couldn't fix. "Do you ever wish you could switch it all off?" she asked. He looked at her with a faint, almost sad smile. "More often than I admit." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by silence, the rain beginning again outside, gentle this time, almost like memory. The air felt alive, heavy with everything they weren't saying. After a while, he looked at her design. "You've improved," he said simply. "There's emotion in your work now. It's rare. Don't lose it." Sophia's heart lifted. not because of the compliment, but because of the sincerity behind it. She had never needed validation before. She just needed to be seen. And in that moment she was. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's not emotion," she added after a pause. "It's truth." He turned to her, eyes narrowing slightly with curiosity. "Truth?" She nodded. "People design with technique, but only a few design with truth. When you stop trying to please everyone and start expressing what's real, everything changes." Andrew stared at her, and for the first time, she saw admiration in his eyes, the kind of respect that wasn't given easily. That night, he didn't ask her to leave early. They worked side by side until almost midnight, not talking much, but sharing a silence that was strangely comforting. When they finally stepped out of the building, the rain had stopped, and the air was clear. The city lights shimmered like stars scattered across the earth. As they walked to the parking lot, Andrew said quietly, "You remind me of something I used to be." She looked up at him. "What's that?" He smiled faintly. "Hopeful." She didn't know how to respond. But the warmth in his tone lingered long after he drove away. That weekend, Sophia couldn't stop thinking about his words. Hopeful. It was such a simple word, yet it felt like an entire universe. Maybe that was what she had been searching for all along. Not success, not recognition, but the feeling that life could still hold hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was what Andrew had been missing too. The office had always been her prison of work and pressure, but now it was turning into something else. A place where two souls were learning to breathe again. The distance between words. The weeks that followed became a blur of movement, deadlines, and whispers. Yet beneath all that noise, a quiet transformation was taking place. Sophia, once invisible in the corners of the design floor, now stood like a flame that refused to go out. Her work spoke louder than her voice ever had. Clients requested her presence in meetings, department heads began trusting her instincts, and even the senior architects, those who had once brushed her aside, now sought her opinion. She was still the same soft-spoken girl who walked into the company months ago, but something inside her had shifted. Her silence was no longer weakness. It had become power, calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. But growth, like light, attracts shadows. The change in her position drew attention, and attention bred rumors. Some whispered that she must have found a secret favor from the CEO. Others murmured about late nights and closed doors. The words floated through corridors like invisible smoke, twisting themselves into shapes that bore no truth. Sophia heard the laughter behind her back, saw the glances that followed her every step, and yet she did not break. Every time she opened a new file or drew a new line on the blueprint, she poured her heart into it. She had learned something precious, that the only voice that should define you is the one you build with your own effort. Andrew noticed the tension, too. He had spent years in boardrooms where power was currency and gossip was sport, but this time it stung differently. Because the person they were talking about wasn't a nameless employee. It was the one person who had reminded him that empathy still existed in a world driven by ambition. He watched her handle the whispers with grace, never defending herself, never lowering her head. She simply worked, quietly and relentlessly, and the purity of that silence humbled him. He wanted to step in, to protect her, but he knew that doing so would only give the rumors more fuel. So he waited, watching from a distance, fighting battles within himself that no one could see. One afternoon, during a presentation with the board, Sophia stood before the massive screen, her design for the Rome Hotel glowing in rich colors. The room was filled with directors, investors, and architects, yet she didn't tremble. Her voice carried calm authority as she explained each curve and column, every choice backed by reason and artistry. When she finished, the room fell into quiet admiration before erupting in applause. Andrew, seated at the head of the table, allowed himself a rare smile, not the professional kind, but the proud, human kind. In that instant, he knew the truth. She didn't need protection. She had built her own armor from honesty and hard work. After the meeting, as everyone dispersed, Andrew stayed behind, his gaze fixed on the city skyline beyond the glass. Sophia walked in a few minutes later to collect her files, stopping when she saw him still there. For a moment they said nothing, the air between them filled with the weight of unspoken gratitude. "You did well today," he said finally, his tone softer than usual. "You handled that room better than most people twice your age." She smiled, setting her papers down carefully. "I just spoke about what I believed in," she replied. "That's all anyone can really do." He nodded slowly. "Belief is rare in this place. Don't lose it." Her eyes met his then, calm but questioning. "Do you ever miss believing?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long time, then turned his gaze toward the fading sunlight. "Every day," he admitted, the honesty catching even him by surprise. "When you build too many walls to protect what you've built, you forget what it felt like to dream without fear." Sophia listened in silence, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. "Then maybe it's time to start dreaming again," she said softly. He turned back to her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You make it sound simple." She shook her head. "It's not simple. It's just worth it." From that day on, something unspoken connected them again. Not the fragile tension of admiration, but the solid bridge of understanding. They didn't share secret looks or stolen words. They shared purpose. Andrew began including her in higher-level discussions, not as a favor, but because she had earned it. Together, they began refining projects with a sense of meaning that had been missing from the company for years. Employees noticed the change. Meetings felt lighter, creativity returned, and the cold walls of corporate routine began to breathe again. It wasn't magic. It was leadership born from humility. Yet despite this growth, a distance still lingered. The distance between two people who cared too much about crossing a line that could destroy everything they had worked for. They respected it, feared it, and at times resented it. There were moments when Andrew would pass by her desk and almost say something but stop himself. Moments when Sophia would glance toward his office and feel the pull of a question she couldn't ask. But both knew that some silences were sacred. Sometimes what makes a bond powerful is not what is said, but what is never allowed to be broken. One late evening, as most of the staff had left, Sophia stood near the large window overlooking the city. The lights below glittered like constellations trapped in glass, and for the first time she realized that her life had begun to align itself with something bigger than her fears. She wasn't just working for recognition anymore. She was working to prove that kindness could thrive even in places built on ambition. When Andrew walked up beside her, they didn't need to greet each other. Their reflections in the glass said enough. "It's strange," she murmured, "how a place that once felt so cold can suddenly feel alive." Andrew looked out over the skyline. "Maybe the building didn't change," he said. "Maybe we did." She smiled at that, her eyes tracing the horizon where night met dawn. "Do you ever think about leaving all this?" she asked. He paused, considering her words. "Sometimes," he said. "But then I remember that running away doesn't erase emptiness. Facing it does?" Sophia nodded slowly. "Then maybe facing it is exactly what this company needed. Someone who remembered how to feel." He glanced at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "And maybe that someone wasn't me." The quiet stretched between them again, but this time it felt peaceful. There was no tension, no uncertainty, only respect. Two people standing side by side, both learning that strength is not the absence of emotion, but the courage to live with it. When Sophia finally gathered her things to leave, Andrew said softly, "Thank you." She turned, surprised. "For what?" He looked at her then, the city lights reflected in his eyes. "For reminding me that people matter more than numbers." She smiled gently. "And thank you," she said, "for giving me the space to prove it." That night, as she walked home under the faint drizzle, Sophia realized that success wasn't about climbing higher, it was about growing deeper. The distance between her and Andrew would always exist, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything they had learned about respect, trust, and the quiet power of belief. And as the rain whispered against the pavement, she understood that sometimes the most life-changing stories aren't the ones written in love, but the ones written in humanity. The glass wall, the rhythm of the city, had grown faster as the season changed. Yet inside the Hale Corporation, the days seemed to move with a softer pulse. Sophia arrived early every morning, walking past the mirror-bright lobby where sunlight spilled through the high windows, and there was a new steadiness in her steps, a confidence that came not from pride, but from purpose. Her work had started to win awards. The Rome Hotel project was being praised across departments for its balance of luxury and heart, and even senior partners from abroad asked to meet the designer who had brought feeling back into steel and stone. But despite the recognition, Sophia remained humble, choosing to let her designs speak rather than her name. In every curve she drew, she tried to hide a small story about hope, about resilience, about people finding light again after long nights. Andrew watched her progress with quiet fascination. He had built empires of glass and concrete, yet none of them had ever reflected warmth the way her work did. He began noticing how meetings changed when she spoke. Voices lowered, arguments softened, and decisions started including words like human, comfort, and belonging. For a man who once measured success only in profits and deadlines, it was unsettling and healing at the same time. He found himself rethinking the company's direction, replacing numbers with narratives, policies with people. But change, even when good, is rarely welcomed by all. A few executives started questioning his decisions, claiming sentiment would weaken the firm's edge. Andrew heard the complaints, yet he stood firm, quietly defending the idea that heart and structure could coexist. And when the pressure became heavy, he would glance toward the design floor where Sophia sat sketching under the golden light, and remember that real leadership meant courage, not comfort. One evening, the board demanded a private meeting with him. They spoke of margins, investors, and the danger of being too emotional. Andrew listened without interrupting, his face calm, but his mind turning. When the meeting ended, he didn't return home. Instead, he walked to the design floor where the lights were still on. He found Sophia standing by the large window, reviewing new concepts pinned to the wall. Her reflection glowed faintly in the glass, half merged with the city beyond. For a long time, he just watched her, realizing how symbolic that image was. Her and the city, separated by a wall of glass, yet influencing each other without a word. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know why I built this office with so much glass?" She turned, surprised by his sudden appearance. "I thought it was for the view," she said. He smiled faintly. "That's what everyone thinks. But it was to remind myself that no matter how high you climb, transparency is the only thing that keeps you grounded." She studied him quietly, sensing that he wasn't merely talking about architecture. He moved closer to the window, his reflection overlapping hers until they both seemed part of the same light. "I spent years chasing perfection," he said, his voice low but steady. "I thought control meant strength. But the more I controlled, the less I felt. This glass, it became a wall instead of a window." Sophia listened without speaking, realizing that beneath the polished surface of his success, there was a man who had forgotten how to feel safe being human. "Maybe walls can become windows again," she said softly. "You just have to stop seeing through them and start seeing yourself in them." He turned toward her, and for the first time in years, his eyes held a kind of relief, as if someone had finally understood the language he'd been trying to speak in silence. That conversation marked the beginning of a quiet revolution inside both of them. Andrew began spending more time with his teams, asking about their ideas instead of dictating them. He encouraged creativity over competition, empathy over ego. Sophia, on the other hand, started mentoring younger designers who reminded her of the girl she used to be, the one too afraid to speak, too uncertain to believe she mattered. Every time she guided someone through doubt, she healed a small piece of herself. Their relationship remained professional, yet every shared glance carried unspoken gratitude, like two travelers walking parallel paths under the same light. Months passed, and the Rome Hotel design was finally completed. When the prototype models were displayed in the central atrium, the entire staff gathered to celebrate. The miniature walls of marble gleamed under the spotlights, reflecting the city's skyline with breathtaking realism. Andrew stood beside Sophia as the board applauded, but he leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "You built more than a building. You built belief." She turned to him, smiling softly. Then maybe belief was what this place was missing. He nodded, pride and humility mixing in his expression. For the first time, the CEO and the employee stood not as ranks, but as equals bound by the same vision. Later that evening, when everyone had left and the lights were dimmed, Sophia returned to the atrium alone. The glass walls shimmered around her, echoing fragments of her own reflection. She thought of the girl she had been on her first day, timid, invisible, terrified of mistakes, and of the woman she was now, calm, confident, unafraid to be seen. The journey hadn't been about fame or power. It had been about freedom. She whispered into the empty space, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the journey itself. Andrew stepped out of the shadows then. He had stayed behind, watching her from the mezzanine above. "I should be the one saying that," he said. She turned, startled, but his tone was gentle. "You reminded me that walls don't protect, they isolate." He walked down the steps, stopping a few feet from her. "This company will always have glass walls, but from now on they'll be built to let the world in, not keep it out." Sophia looked at him, the faint glow of the city reflecting in both their eyes. There was nothing more to say. They had already spoken all that mattered through actions, through quiet resilience, through the unspoken understanding that change begins not in boardrooms, but in hearts. When she finally left the building that night, the air outside felt lighter, almost alive. The glass tower behind her no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a lighthouse. And as she walked home beneath the soft drizzle of spring, she realized that the greatest transparency was not in the windows of the office, but in the clarity within herself. She was no longer the girl who feared the dark. She had become the light that guided others through it. The morning after the rain, the morning sun broke gently through the skyline, casting golden ribbons across the Hale Corporation Tower. And for the first time in years, it felt like the light truly belonged there. Months had passed since the night of transformation in the atrium, and the company that once felt cold and mechanical now breathed with a quiet rhythm of life. The walls that had once only echoed footsteps now carried laughter. The long corridors were lined with sketches and ideas instead of silence, and meetings were no longer about deadlines alone. They were about creation, about meaning, about something that would outlast them all. The change had started quietly, like the faint sound of rain on glass, but it had spread through every corner, touching every heart that worked within those walls. And at the center of it stood Sophia, the woman who had once been invisible, now the very reason the place had found its soul again. Sophia's life had changed in ways she had never dared to imagine. She had been promoted to lead architect for the firm's newest expansion projects, her designs celebrated not only for their beauty, but for the way they made people feel. Every blueprint she drew carried a heartbeat. Every structure she envisioned told a story about humanity, resilience, and hope. But what she cherished most was not the recognition or the awards. It was the sense of belonging, the peace of knowing that she had finally found her place in a world that once made her doubt she had one. She had become a mentor to others, the same way Andrew had been a guide for her, and every time she saw a young designer struggling with insecurity, she would smile and remind them, quiet voices can build loud dreams. Andrew, too, had changed. The man who had once lived behind layers of professionalism and guarded control now moved with calm ease, his presence no longer cold or distant. The staff who used to fear his authority now respected him for his integrity and his humility. He had learned to listen more than he spoke, to value people not for what they produced, but for what they believed in. The company's profits rose in ways that even he hadn't expected, not because of new strategies, but because people began to care again. It was as if the walls of glass had started reflecting something different, not ambition, but compassion. And though he rarely said it out loud, Andrew knew that it was Sophia's quiet strength that had begun this change. She had reminded him that the greatest architecture was not built from concrete, but from courage. The annual company gala arrived like a celebration of everything they had endured and rebuilt together. The hall was filled with lights, music, and the warmth of unity that could not be bought. Andrew stood at the podium, addressing hundreds of employees and guests. His speech was calm, deliberate, and sincere. Success, he said, is not measured by how high we climb, but by how many people rise with us. A building without light is just a structure, but a company without heart is just a name. As he spoke those words, his eyes searched the crowd until they found Sophia standing near the back, modestly dressed in a simple ivory gown, her expression serene. For a brief moment their eyes met, and the room seemed to fade around them. It was not the gaze of a CEO and an employee. It was the silent understanding of two people who had rebuilt something invisible yet infinite. When the applause ended and the evening drifted into laughter and conversation, Sophia stepped outside to the balcony, seeking a moment of quiet. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain that had passed earlier. The city below shimmered like liquid gold, every light a reminder of how far she had come. Andrew joined her a few moments later, holding 2 glasses of water instead of champagne. They stood side by side, not needing to fill the silence. "You've changed this place," he said softly after a long pause. "No," she replied, smiling. "This place changed itself. I just believed it could." He looked at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Belief," he said quietly, "is rarer than talent." She laughed gently. "And yet, belief builds what talent alone cannot." They spoke of the future, of the projects ahead, of the people they hoped to inspire. Andrew told her about a new scholarship program he wanted to start for young architects who couldn't afford to study but had vision in their hearts. Sophia offered to design the mentorship framework for it, ensuring every student would feel seen and supported. It wasn't business, it was purpose. Somewhere between their words, they realized that their story had never been about ambition or success or even destiny. It was about the extraordinary change that happens when people choose compassion over pride, trust over fear, humanity over ego. When Sophia left the gala that night, the rain had begun again, soft and rhythmic like a lullaby. She didn't rush to find a cab. Instead, she walked slowly through the quiet streets, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement, her reflection glowing in every puddle she passed. The rain no longer reminded her of loneliness. It reminded her of beginnings. She thought of her first night in the building, the silence, the fear, the locked doors, and she smiled. That night she had thought she was trapped, but now she understood. Sometimes life locks you in so it can unlock you from within. Andrew stood by the window of his office long after the celebration had ended, watching the same rain fall over the same city, but with eyes that saw differently now. He thought of Sophia, of her resilience, of how she had turned her pain into purpose, and he whispered a quiet promise to himself, to never again let fear dictate his humanity. The world outside was vast and unpredictable, but for the first time in years, he felt at peace with not controlling it. He had learned that leadership was not about standing above others, but walking beside them. And love, though never spoken, was about respect, not possession. The next morning dawned bright and golden after the rain. Sunlight streamed across the glass walls of the tower, scattering reflections that danced across the floors like blessings. Sophia arrived early as always, carrying her sketchbook and her coffee, her steps light, her heart steady. She looked up at the building, the place that had once intimidated her, and now smiled as if greeting an old friend. Inside, she paused by the window where it had all begun, the very same spot where she had once stood, uncertain and afraid. She touched the cool glass and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude to a person or a moment, it was to the journey itself, to every storm that had shaped her into the woman she was now. And as the city came alive outside, the office filled again with the sound of life, voices, laughter, footsteps, dreams. Sophia took her seat, ready to design again, to build not just structures but stories, to remind the world that even behind walls of glass, hearts could still beat freely. For she had learned the greatest lesson of all. that real touch doesn't come from hands but from faith, and real transformation doesn't come from power but from courage. She had never been touched before, not by love, not by recognition, not by destiny, but in that tower of glass and rain, she had finally been touched by something far greater: purpose.